In this episode, I'm going to answer the question, what is a board game anyway? Throughout their history, board games have been conventionally understood to be a game conducted on a flat surface that is segmented in some fashion with pieces that can be moved around the play area. The first known instance of the phrase board game being used in print was 1854. Despite the relatively recent origin of that term, the use of board games has been an active cultural practice across centuries and around the globe. Indeed, board gaming predates the written word. Board games have been found as far back as the Bronze Age Giraffe civilization, based in what is now known as Iran. One of the oldest known board games, Senet, was found in the tombs linked to Predynastic and First Dynasty in Egypt in 3500 and 3100 BC respectively. A hieroglyphic painting of Egyptian Queen Nefertari playing what appears to be Senet was found in her tomb. There are references to board gaming in Homer's Iliad in the 8th century BC. The game Wei-Chi'I, otherwise known as Go in Japanese, has been traced to 625 BC in China. A game Patolli, involving rolling beans with white pips or white markings, with some beans having blank sides, was played by the Aztecs in 1300 AD. The game of Mancala has origins that trace back to Africa in the 7th century AD. And today, there are 100 variants of Mancala played all around the world, with some literature suggesting earlier followers of the Islamic prophet Muhammad carried player boards with them as they traveled all around the world. Board games have been deeply integrated into human history, and we are deeply, deeply grateful to the diversity of cultures, both ancient and modern, that brought us so many board games. And I'm offering these historical perspectives to plant the seeds in your mind that board games are truly for everyone. While board games have always been a part of human histories across cultures, contemporary gatekeeping, and exclusionary practices such as those that are detailed in this podcast series should be cast in even starker relief. The long history of board games has resulted in a cultural practice with seemingly infinite permutations and possibilities. The category of board games has been expanded to include a variety of cards and dice, storytelling, social deduction games, and often these games are played with no board at all. Even the label of tabletop games seems too limiting for the breadth and possibilities of what is contained within the category of board games. Board Game Geek, that comprehensive online catalog of games past and present, is Catholic in its embrace of the full gamut of games across the spectrum of the Kalawa, famous guy who talked about board games, categories of Agon, the competitive games, Iliad, which are games of chance, mimicry or simulations, which are role-playing and play-acting, or the Ilix, or games involving vertigo. At last count, and this was the time of writing as an update in 2022, there are more than 3,500 game entries and counting. That number is even higher now, I'm sure. And there was an increase at that time of 13,200 in under a year. And for the purposes of this podcast series, we're going to look at board games as a category, as ones that appeared on Board Game Geek, a user-maintained and crowdsourced global repository reflective of the current cultural practices of gaming, certainly in North America. And here's my rationale. BGG, Board Game Geek, is actively curated, contested, and updated by millions of users worldwide. The human participates by various research methods, including this podcast series, including that online survey I'll be talking about, make little distinction of their games of Catan, Smash Up, King of Tokyo, and their Dungeons & Dragons campaigns. For that reason, some games might straddle the line between pure play activities, or even encroach into pure role-playing games, without the need for a tabletop surface upon which to play. This decision might rankle some gaming purists, but I believe this decision to focus on games listed on Board Game Geek reflects the present realities of board games as a lived cultural practice. BGG listings expand every single day, including everything from Advanced Dungeons & Dragons Battle System 2nd Edition to the contortionist party game Twister, where participants twist their bodies, with no table necessary at all, in order to place their hands and feet on randomly selected colored dots on a square plastic floor mat, to the bizarre folk game called Eat Poop You Cat, which is so gross, the 1984 game of broken telephone played with only a pencil and a piece of paper, wherein each participant writes a sentence and then is secretly shown that sentence, and then it's translated by the player on their left into a drawing, and so on. Contemporary board games, be they analog or digital, like their video game counterparts, are evolving to embed or integrate themselves into our increasingly chaotic and time-strapped lives, tracking along the same casual revolution trajectory as observed by Jesper Juhl back in 2010. Like mobile app digital game design, analog game design is evolving to create casual micro or mini games that can be played on the fly or integrated into busy schedules. Examples include the Button Shy collection of games featuring designers such as Elizabeth Hargrave of Wingspan fame. She was the creator of Tussie Mussy, and this is a game with only 18 cards about the Victorian language of flowers that can be played without a table, even standing up or waiting in line, with gameplay lasting a scant 5 to 7 minutes. The expansive universe of board games demonstrates the potentialities of analog gaming and gives us a glimpse into what board games might someday become. How then does a board game differ from other gaming modalities? I'm going to argue, controversially, that board games and games played on tablets, laptops, computer screens, mobile and entertainment consoles, wearables, or desktop computers are in constant communication and in sympathy with each other. Games in their many instantiations are forever informing each other. Board games and digital games can be understood as simply differentiated by the presence or absence of artificial intelligence of that computerized player and or helper assisting the human player with the game. The foundation, the core or heart of these games, and the gameplay experience are similar. Both analog and digital gaming conform to the Galois, and that's that famous game scholar who defined games, his own definition of games, which is that, quote, restricted, closed, and protected universe, unquote, with players then engaging in a series of, quote, formalized interactions, unquote, and that's Zalen and Zimmerman, a game of miniature artificial system, which is basically the definition of a game further, allowing players to escape reality, to engage in safe, consequence-free, no strings attached, unproductive conflict, problem solving, competition, and or cooperation to solve a shared challenge. And those are a network of little definitions of gaming. Both analog and digital games can offer the experience where the context, this is a quote, is defamiliarized just enough, unquote, and that's Mary Flanagan's quote, to help the player separate from the everyday. Both game states, both analog and digital, share a play experience constrained by rules, formalized interactions, and boundaries. So one really handy definition, and one way to distinguish between board games and digital games or mobile games or video games, comes from Scott Nicholson. And he looked at board games that had been interpreted as digital games. And this is where I come up with my definition. So it's all about the game state, how it is managed and maintained. So with a video game, the management and enforcement of rules, the game setup and teardown are all managed by the software or the artificial intelligence in that digital version of the games. In the analog version of these board games, as looked at by Scott Nicholson, he noted that the players or player maintain the conditions of the game state, and they're responsible for implementing and supporting that game state. The earliest computer games were often simply attempts to replicate board games and role-playing games, with the software and hardware acting as the rules lawyer, enforcing game standards and stipulations, the banker doling out chits, funny money, and tabulating points. And there's a great look at Wolfgang von Klempen's computerized chess player in the form of Mechanical Turk in 1769, or in a 1951 Turo Champ program created to play full games of chess. Computer designers were really looking at how to interpret board games into the computer space. And so that's how they drew their inspiration. And it's very interesting to me that there is such a, dividing line between video game analysis and board games. So in digital games, it is the AI, rather than human actors, which acts as the dungeon master or storyteller, adding thematic context in some cases, atmosphere and color to enhance the enjoyment of the players. The only difference between the game played digitally, in this case, or a game played in the analog format on a board or as a board game, whether computerized agents join you at the figurative table, assisting you with the maintenance of the game state, is that distinction. Analog board games and digital games share the same foundations, whether they're a mutual experience of that miniaturized system, whereby players are constrained by rules, and they are played in digital spaces or in physical spaces in an analog format in the meat space of face-to-face play. The distinction is how that game state is managed. A little scholarly, but I promise it won't be too bad. So I'm going to draw on the Toronto School of Communications Theory, and this is a proud Canadian content moment. And this is all about Marshall McLuhan, who really revolutionized the way we think about communication way back in the 60s. So I'm going to argue, using that framework, that board games are a cool media that simply require greater and more active, imaginative, and physical participation from the human players to maintain the game state. The individual needs to bring a little more of themselves to the cool medium, and this is the distinction McLuhan made. There's cold and there's hot. So the cold medium, they need to heighten and immerse themselves in that experience. They bring in a lot more imagination. So in this case, reading might be considered a cool media because you're bringing more to your experience of that media. You have to fill in the gaps. Listeners to early radio plays, as an example of cool media, had to create their own mental pictures of the action. By contrast, a ticket holder of a D-box movie experience is inundated with sensory input. And that's an example of a hot medium. Where you're cherry shaking, there's water misting on your faces, there's air jets flowing over you, if you've ever had this experience, while experiencing immersive, high-resolution visuals and audio. There's not much you need to bring to the table in that case. And the same comparison might be made of analog and digital games. For example, when I play a game of Go, that ancient abstract area control game, I can and do imagine myself as a resplendent empress, conquering territories, even as the still black and white stones on an etched piece of board offer no such thematic prompts. So I'm bringing stuff to that experience. In my games of Go, I must exert all the powers of my imagination to apply this fantasy framework to this highly abstract game. So too, as I painstakingly set up a game of Agricola, with all of its tiny wooden animals and little fence lines, I have to situate my bustling little acreage in my mind's eye, seeing more than the little cardstock tiles and the naive livestock-shaped wooden figures. On the other hand, when I'm playing video games, they jam multi-sensory input into every receptor, leaving little room for my own imaginings. I'm just thinking here of Doom. I don't have to bring much to the table when I'm playing Doom. In this case, the digital game is the hot medium. More is done for you. And the analog game is the cool one. The analog game asks more of me and my fellow players in both the maintenance of the game state and requires more of my imaginative investment, my imagination, in enhancing that cool media of this kind of play. And you can see why some folks really like board gaming, because it really does ask a little more of you. And as a cool medium, you can bring more to it. With this in mind, the definition of board games used in this podcast series embraces both single-player, face-to-face, player-to-player interaction across a wide range of board game, dice, tabletop role-playing experiences, social deduction, and party games. The definition of board game that I'm going to rely upon as I walk you through some of my findings includes all of these varied tabletop types and embraces the digital or online instantiation of the tabletop experience, which looks at things like Tabletop Simulator, Board Game Arena, Tabletopia. These online platforms replicate, to varying degrees of success, the analog elements of cards, dice, tiles, game pieces, turn-taking, even the tabletops themselves. In Tabletop Simulator, you can flip the entire table to demonstrate your frustration if you lose, with less cleanup, I guess. While there is a growing market for solo board games, an increasing number of hobby board games that include a solo variant, the majority of board games necessarily involve an element of human interaction as part of the gameplay, which typically features social interaction, social negotiation, close interactions with, and observation of your fellow players. Analog play, therefore, is primarily a form of gaming whereby you gather with other players to play in competition or in cooperation, employing analog elements such as dice, cards, miniatures, and other tactile game pieces, be they real or virtual. I'm going to make a distinction here between digital board games and analog board games as necessary, as there's a burgeoning market for digital versions of pieces-laden cardboard versions. And there's a lot of genre sprawling, hybridization, and ever-evolving definition of board games. And so you have to really think about board games in a very expansive frame. The participants of this research kind of looked at Board Game Geek and their ever-expanding game list just as Catholic as BGG does in their embrace of what board games are. And so they're very open to a very broad definition of board games, and I've decided I'm going to be too, as I convey this research to you. And this is just a distinction to talk about how much potential there is in the board game space to become something even more than it is now. Imagine what will happen if constraints and gatekeeping efforts, both explicit and implicit, were entirely removed. Imagine what we might see. As I shared before, board games have been a somewhat under-researched area in the field of game studies, with most of the field focusing on computer or digital games. Indeed, the word analog only exists by way of a negative comparison to the digital. This is a quote. And this is Torner, Trammell, and Waldron. While the foundational books of contemporary game studies, Homo Ludens by Huizinga and Calois, Man, Play, and Games, two really important works you have to read when you're in game studies, they were written about board games and sports games. And that's very interesting to think about. But despite that, there's been an overarching focus on digital games in the field of game studies. And game scholars that invoke Calois and Huizinga texts to analyze the dynamics, affordances, or features and cultural practices of computer and video games usually do it without any reference to board games or analog games. Analog games are occupying the margins of game studies despite their role in influencing and inspiring digital games, and their ongoing and persistent popularity throughout histories. And despite the specific lack of research, scholarly research in this area of gender and racial dynamics in board gaming, and that board gaming hobby, tracking the cultural practices and challenges faced by contemporary board gamers can be a difficult task, given a necessary reliance on fan, journalistic, and industry accounts of board games and board gaming. There is, however, a small but growing field of researchers in contemporary game studies looking at the cultural impact of board gaming and the dynamics of gender and race playing out in board game spaces. Board gaming is often divided into two distinct categories by industry and fan communities: mass market or consumer games, including gaming staples such as Risk, Monopoly, The Game of Life, Scrabble, where references to the game designer are often absent from the box entirely, and hobby games where games designers are listed very prominently. And so my focus for this research rests mainly in the hobby game community. Hobby board gaming itself is often subdivided into two other overarching styles. We love to compartmentalize, don't we, folks? There's the Amerigame, often known by its more pejorative moniker, which is Ameritrash. Amerigames are deeply rooted in theme, tend toward longer playtimes, and use elements of Iliad or luck or chance, big dice games. Examples of Amerigames are often found in mass market board games like Risk, or Battlestar Galactica, the board game, or Twilight Imperium, or Cosmic Encounter, which I actually played with Tom Vassell. He said it was the worst game of Cosmic Encounter he ever played. He lost horribly, and that was not because we were good. Other players were better. Dead of Winter, The Amerigame style of gaming often features direct conflict between players, player elimination, with unsuccessful players being forced out of gameplay, I hate that, and themes involving warfare or violence. The other style of game is the Eurogame, which is distinguished by games that are often not particularly thematic, with gameplay and mechanics that are often situated loosely around the themes of pastoral management, market dynamics, trading, building, or the acculturation of resources and wealth through colonization. The rise of the Eurogame style has been traced back to various factors, with one theory suggesting that the German toy manufacturer and game publisher Ravensburger, their decision to launch that annual games contest called Spiel des Jahres in 1978. The Spiel des Jahres has continued each year to this moment of writing and has been a key catalyst for development of the Eurogame style. German designers in this style eschew themes of violence and the dynamics of direct player conflict in favor of a slow burn of resource collection, trading, negotiation, and so-called point salad win conditions, whereby players win by means of collecting points in a myriad of often complex ways, with increasing points as multipliers. Designer Wolfgang Kramer, a multiple Spiel des Jahres winner and a co-designer of El Grande, has said of the Eurogame style approach, quote, "Players act constructive in order to improve their own results. They do not act destructive and destroy the playing of their opponents. These games are distinguished by their focus on collaborative play, with low randomness or absent alia entirely, no player elimination. They use auctions, worker placement, the use of tile placement representing farmland, colonies, or tracts of residential or commercial real estate. Games such as Carcassonne, Ticket to Ride, Lost Cities, Catan are considered Eurogames. And Eurogames, and particularly the popularity of Catan, designed by a German game designer Klaus Trober, are often credited with the increased popularity of board games in Europe and North America in the late 90s into the 2000s. Indeed, due to its popularity and staying power, as an aside, the rights to Catan were sold in 2018 to a private equity company, PAI Partners, for $1.4 billion after it had sold 22 million copies. Historically, in the mass market or consumer category of games, not much public attention was given to the designers of those popular games. Authorship of game designs was not central nor prominent as a consideration to players much before the late 1970s, and instead these consumer board games were governed by a so-called folk tradition, whereby rules and approaches of play were passed around within communities. Given the rise of the European Eurogame tradition, the name and reputation of the designer became a key consideration within hobby board game fandom, with some game designers attracting cult-like followings, thus the Who of game design or authorship, after the rise of the Eurogame in the 80s and 90s, became a key consideration for hobby board gamers. In the hobby board game community, game designers are important, command a fan base, and determine what kinds of stories are told, what mechanics are privileged, what themes are used, and what ideas, values, and ideologies are embedded in the games, as I'm going to explore in next week's podcast. Thank you so much for listening to this. I really appreciate it. Please like, subscribe, maybe share this with a friend. I really, really appreciate you listening. I hope you have a great day. Thanks.